Hello, you're listening to Flame Radio on 1521 medium wave and online. My name is John Cheek and welcome to our regular radio series, Walking on Eggshells, made in conjunction with Crossing Point in Liverpool, a Christian response to domestic abuse. And I'll give a warning straight away that during the programme this afternoon, this evening, whenever you hear it, we will be discussing the subject of domestic abuse. Anyway, welcome to the programme. I'm delighted to say that we are very privileged here on Flame Radio today to be joined by a very special guest. We're joined by the writer, the author, Donna Ward, who is going to be talking with us today about her new book, the first of three. There is going to be a trilogy, the first of three, and it is autobiography. And the title of the book is called Forged by Fire, Crucible of Flame. Donna Ward, welcome to Flame Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Donna, just for the first 2 or 3 minutes, can you just bring before the listeners a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm a mum of 2. I'm in my 40s. I'm a black female, obviously female, and I'm going to say I've had a really interesting life, very chaotic and traumatic in places, but very interesting. Was raised in a Christian home, which caused as many problems as it solved, but it did give me an inherent appreciation that God existed, and it's probably that one thing that has been an anchor through all of the chaos that I've experienced. So just to give a very short summary, I would say my personal life is a travesty and my career life is amazing and outstanding. So it's very strange following God and having equal amounts of what I consider very negative things, but also very positive things that bless you. And really, that's one of the themes that runs throughout the entire book. Is even if we are experiencing something that is very negative, there's also there's a way of finding blessing in those times as well, and it's I think it can be very confusing having both tragedies and blessings in your life at the same time, because the world kind of teaches us that you could only have one emotion at a time, whereas I've found the reality to be quite different from that. So hopefully the book gives a little bit of a peek through the window into that duality of being human, but also that duality of being a Christian and having faith in God, and experiencing both positive and negative things through life, and how God has kept me through all of that.
Was that desire, Donna, one of your main motives for writing your story and having it published? Was that your heart to communicate that sort of sentiment?
No. So I never intended to write a book ever. I remember probably 20 years ago now, I was in the middle of a dire situation where my ex-husband had taken my 2-year-old and failed to return him. So that obviously caused a lot of anxiety, stress. It was a horrible time. But I also remember that time spending time with God and him letting me know that I would write a book. At the time, I wrote down all of these topics, a lot of the topics that we're going to probably cover today. And I've had that kind of list for many years. I've always written, so I'm a journaler. So I've probably got 20 years worth of journals stashed around my house and in bookshelves and things like that. And writing for me was a real, not an escape, but it was a way, it was an outlet for all the things going on in the inside that I didn't really have a way of expressing to anybody. So I would say really writing started being about me, and just having a way and a place to let some of these things out. And probably the desire to make it into a book didn't come till much later, and that was only because I knew God had told me that I would write a book, so I knew it was on the cards. Otherwise I wouldn't have bothered. All the little journals would stay in their little corners in my house, but God has different ideas.
And Donna, I'm sure that there's people listening to this now who are journalers, who have all sorts of journals and diaries filed away at home, thinking that nobody will ever read them again. But who knows? Who knows? Donna, I do know a little bit about your story, and I'm going to bring Abby in shortly, but I do know a little bit about your story, Donna. I don't know if you're able to, just maybe for a few minutes, to set the scene a little bit and talk about nearly 20 years ago and how your husband, in effect, kidnapped your daughter.
Yeah, it was my son, but yes.
Sorry, son.
It's fine. Little one, my daughter's safe and sound. I mean, I think first of all, just so you know, that the incident with my son being kidnapped, in that I've written in a book, that was just the first incident of multiple kidnap incidents. So that is just to be aware of, so that you understand this book is not it's not a linear, oh, this is when things started happening, this is when things finished happening. It's not like that at all. For those who don't know my story, I think it's important to know that I was raised in a, what's the term they call it for? They call it now, I think, in a zealous Christian household.
Fundamentalist.
Yes, let's go fundamentalist. So it was very much like living an Amish lifestyle. We had electricity, running water, all of those sorts of things, but we completely shunned the world. I mean, I'm very lucky that I got to stay in school. Excuse me. But other than school, church, and home, there was no other kind of external influences. So it was TV, radio, even reading materials, everything was vetted and monitored or banished. So that led to, I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but it just created extremely vulnerable, naive, gullible children and young people. At the age of kind of 15 and 16, there were so many things that I didn't know that other people took for granted. I mean, one of the things that I always say to people is through a group of people that I'd met, ended up taking heroin from the age of 15. And it probably wasn't until a couple of years later than that I realised what it was, because I'd never really heard of drugs, didn't know that drugs were bad for you. Other people were taking it and they were like, do you want some? I was like, oh, okay, as if it was just, do you want a can of pop, or do you want some cake? And it didn't seem any more unusual to me than that. So having grown up in that very secluded environment and then being put in a position where I was kind of out in the world, it meant that the decisions that I made were not the best decisions. And so it meant that, meeting up with and befriending and eventually having a relationship with the man who introduced me to drugs, and not the gentle stuff, the hard stuff. And then meeting another man and getting married, and actually just marrying into abuse. And I didn't know about red flags. I didn't know about manipulation. I just didn't know. I was so ignorant of people, so ignorant of relationships, so ignorant of things like I didn't really know that people lied. which sounds ridiculous. But I'd never really been around anybody who'd lied, because I was only ever at home, at church or at school. And apart from the odd lie from a child, it never occurred to me that the grown-ups lie, adults lie, and they will lie to you in order to get something from you. So yeah, just not really understanding that adults lied, which is completely crazy looking back, because I clearly had met adults who'd lied, but we grew up in such a fearful environment. It didn't occur to me to lie because I knew the punishment would be so heavy and swift. And when you have nothing else to compare it to, I didn't realize that my upbringing was abnormal at all. I believed everything that everyone said to me because I had no reason not to. And yeah, it led to some really, really hard situations for me, hard situations for my family. And I would say it probably impacted me for 20 years out of my adulthood, just going through life being majorly disappointed by, things like people telling lies. Even now I have a massive aversion to people who lie, and it's not that I don't want to forgive them or anything like that, but it impacts me so much and makes it very difficult for me to trust people who I know have lied. And it's like I say, my upbringing was so disciplinarian. I honestly thought that if I told a lie today, the sky would open up, a bolt of lightning would come down, and God would kill me. That's the sort of fear that we grew up with. And I think you always apply how you experience life to other people, and just not knowing any better. Yeah, it made for some trouble, let's say.
Oh, Donna. And you went forward into life and you ended up getting married. And do you think perhaps maybe your previous trusting nature perhaps maybe left you, shall we say, wide open to abuse?
Yeah. What I didn't realise at the time is that I'd already left a situation of abuse at home. And that was really the only way I knew how to have relationships with others. So I'd grown up in, I don't know what term they use now, because the terms for abuse all change. Aside from experiencing sexual abuse as a child at home from a parent, I also had parents who had lied about me to everybody that I knew. I don't know how it impacted me so much as a child. I actually believed the lies they told about me. So yeah, I don't know, it's very, very difficult sometimes for me to put into words the emotional abuse, the physical and sexual abuse, then abuse that comes from isolating and separating, particularly a growing child's mind and body from the rest of the world. And so growing up without a voice, even, so things, we weren't allowed to ask questions or to question anything, and we were told that in order to honor God, we had to honor our parents, and they were the authority over us that God had put in that position. So if we disobeyed our parents, we were actually disobeying God. And so I grew up with that being normal. And so of course I then apply that to new relationships that I have with other people, and suddenly my boyfriend / husband becomes the person with authority over me, and I've got to obey them, because obeying them is the same as obeying God, because that's what I was taught as a child. and not even being aware that was happening till 20 years later, when I have a little bit more knowledge and experience to be able to recognize those things. So I didn't even recognize it at the time, and all I did was leave one abusive home with a sociopath parent to go and get married to exactly the same, because that's really all I knew, and it felt comfortable.
Abby, can I bring you in at this point? We're going to take a break for some music in a minute, but Abby, can I bring you in on this particular matter? And you've heard what Donna's been talking about. Is there, I suppose a lot of this boils down to issues of trust. And in Donna's case, and in the case of many, many thousands of victims, there is a real disconnect from reality. There's a real disconnect from life caused by the abuse, pure and simple. Is there a way of recognizing this disconnect, and perhaps maybe reconnecting with real life, with reality again?
Great question, John. I'm just going to read a quote from your book, Donna, where you put, I started life working from a deficit, blind to the impact of childhood. And I know that in the beginning chapters of your book, you mention about self-respect. And I just wondered, perhaps in answer to John's question, or just to bring it into the topic of that trust and rebuilding and disconnect, whether you could maybe put self-respect and kind of trust side by side, and just talk about them in relation to each other from your experiences. You share a little bit in your book, maybe just in answering John's question a little bit.
Yeah, not a problem. I think the trust and the self-respect, I was blind to them both. The only trust I knew was out of obligation or out of pressure and being overpowered and dominated. So I don't really think that was trust, because trust is not something that you can force on another person. Trust is something that you build on, that you can grow on, and is actually completely within your own power. I lived entirely from a place of powerlessness. I didn't have any power. I didn't know people like me could even have power or a say. Things like being able to say no to people was not something that I was able to do for a very long time, because of being growing up being so dominated and controlled. That, for me, that links directly with the self-respect. When you are forced, pressured, manipulated, and forced by fear to comply with somebody else, being able to, you don't have the ability to think about yourself. You don't have the ability to think, what do I want? Because you're actually in, I know a lot of therapists use the kind of fight or flight mode, particularly when you're in an abusive situation. And for lots of people in those circumstances, you are in flight or fight, either way. The issue is that you're not able to think clearly. You can't think clearly, you can't think rationally, you can't take yourself out of the circumstance and out of the emotion of the circumstances to be able to think, hang on a second, let me just reflect on what's happening here. It's like living in a war zone. So every moment of every day, you are worried, if I do this, if I say this, what will happen to me? I'd better not do this, because I know the consequence of that. There will be, harm will come to me. And actually living in that state of constant fear, of constant stress, you have the whole concept of self is lost. I think probably in my early relationship, certainly in my first marriage, I conflated that forced, compliant, doing what this person wanted me to do out of fear with love. Completely conflated the two things. And so I really genuinely thought that in order to love my husband, I needed to do things that would make him happy. I needed to do things that would really not make him angry. And actually, when you look back on that, that's exactly what childhood was. It was a series of all my decisions are based on somebody else and their response to what I might be doing. And so it was decades before I understood that I had my own power, that I had the ability to respect and actually respecting myself. It was a really difficult mental process to go through, because it felt selfish. It felt genuinely selfish. We've been raised that we're Christians, we give. Everybody else's problems and issues, they take priority. We're here to serve everybody else, and what we need is never considered. And I think that's a lot that goes the same for a lot of people coming from abusive situations, is their sense of self is destroyed. They don't have one. If you've not been allowed to have one, you can't develop that, and it's a real sad shame.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks for being so open and so honest here. Forged by Fire, Crucible of Flame. And Donna, thanks for being so open so far about your life story. Also with me in the studios here today is Abby from Crossing Point. Abby, I don't know if you want to bring in any observations about the book, as you've had a sneak preview of Forged by Fire. I don't know if you wish to bring in any observations or questions so far.
Yeah, I think from working for a domestic abuse charity and my own story in life, it's fantastic to hear, Donna, just the clarity with which you're being able to speak and pinpoint the specifics of what was going on emotionally, and that sense of self and that journey, and the insight and the hindsight that you talk of as you're sharing with us on the radio today and through the book is really amazing, just to see the revelations that you've had. And as we were talking before about self-respect, one of the things you comment on is that self-respect is what influences our decisions, and you've just been sharing with us about how not having that in the early years and being in an obligatory relationship where there wasn't an understanding of what your needs were or what your desires were, meant that you mimicked the dynamic of relationship with your parents in the formative years in your then marriage relationship. And have just shared how you can see that direct overlay whilst as you've become an adult and are engaging in an adult world, still not having that sense of self and still living the learned expectations and having the childhood mindsets. You share through your book about some of the difficulties in that relationship, as you shared at the beginning of the radio, the really devastating situation with your son that took place. But I really would love to just share an extract from your book, if you're happy for me to do that, about a situation where you are beginning to see and understand some of the journey through the disconnect to connect with self and with others and with God, and the understanding of self-respect. And I'm just going to read. It's a couple of pages, but I will read at a steady pace that's not too fast and not too slow. Hopefully, listeners, you'll be able to follow along with me. But before I read that, Donna, I just wondered if you could just say a few words about this particular reference to the garden experience that you had before I just read the extract?
So yeah, I actually had that experience whilst at a drug rehabilitation centre. So I was scheduled to be there for a year, which is a long time in anybody's life. It was a Christian rehab, and there was a lot of manual labour. So once you'd gone through your initial, I think it was 4-week detox, you were put into the programme and you were just busy all day, mostly doing manual labour and manual tasks. So this was one of those where we've been taken off to go and do some gardening. And God spoke to me through a bush, not quite the same way as Moses, but it wasn't on fire, but he genuinely spoke to me through this bush. And what he did was God told me about himself, and he told me about me. And that whole concept of God being the gardener, and only making sure that he uses tools that are able to separate the weeds and the thorns from the actual healthy parts of the bush, and that through this pruning process, actually he was releasing and helping this plant to grow. And to me, it spoke of my life, but I guess it's a reflection of the human condition, in that life does throw thorns, it throws weeds, and we have bad things growing up alongside the good things in our life, and they become intertwined and interlocked, and you do find that the bad things can strangle out the strength and hope and beauty of the good things that we have. God is a gentle God. That's what I learned that day. I'd never known of a gentle God. I grew up in a home where God was going to strike me with lightning. I was going to go to hell. I was beaten with a belt and shoes and all kinds. That's the only thing I knew about God, was a vengeful God. But he showed me a God that was caring to the point where he took longer to do a job that could have been done much quicker. If he hadn't been as careful, he'd been happy to lose some healthy bits off the plant because, oh, this bit's just too tangled, I'll just chop that whole bit out and we can grow it again. And he didn't do that. He took his time and trimmed and carefully lifted up and made sure that all the healthy parts of that plant stayed intact. And that's what blew my mind, was the detail and the precision and the time God bothered to take that time. And I'd never had anyone in my life take the time before. Nobody really cared to that length. And even if they did care to that degree, they didn't have the skills available to help me untangle the mess that was my life. Like, nobody had that power or that skill except for God.
Fantastic. I'll just read the extract and maybe we can continue. Just dwell on that for a moment, because I think this is such a powerful part of your book. To one side of the garden lay a dense tangle of bush, thick with thorns and foliage, almost strangling itself with a deep, complex network of roots, branches, and weeds that seemed to spread from every direction. My job that day was to cut this bad boy down. I stood close, and it was easily 6 or 7 feet tall and as wide as a small van. Somewhere in this devastation was a live and beautiful bush. All I had to do was free it. It was at that moment God showed me something amazing. The bush was once healthy and alive, but its life had been almost strangled out of existence. It was penetrated on all sides by giant thorns, weeds, and thistles which encroached and suffocated it. It couldn't grow, couldn't see the light, and without care and attention from a gardener, it would almost certainly die. That day, God showed me nature of a true gardener. I didn't even need to close my eyes. Somehow God was able to show me these things whilst I was wide awake, allowing me to see things other people can't. I don't know how he does it or why, but I have grown to love this secret part of my life with God. I watched as the gardener arrived, looking over the mangled mess of bush and beginning to examine it carefully. Instead of getting an axe to start chopping it down, which would have been a simple option for most, He picked up a small set of pruners. He began to very carefully snip and clip the weeds and drop them to the ground where they could do no harm. He was careful to protect the bush hidden inside this tangled mess. Whenever he spotted green foliage belonging to the bush, he tenderly caressed the leaves and trimmed away the weeds and dross surrounding it so one more part was freed. He worked at this for a very long time, never getting impatient or willing to lose a live part to get the job done quicker. He painstakingly cut and snipped away at the mass only when it was safe to do so without damaging the bush contained within. His hand was always gentle and considerate, giving the greatest care to protect what was his. I looked down at his hands and noticed they were shredded and bleeding from being ripped at by the giant thorns. I don't remember seeing him wince in pain, not even once. I imagined the pain he must feel being pricked and torn by the thorny overgrown mass he was attempting to tame. My memory was suddenly pricked. There was another who bled for me. He too knew the searing pain of thorns being driven into flesh. The thorns were made into a crown of mockery and driven deep into his skull. My Jesus, the pain and suffering you must have endured on the cross is something I can only imagine, in the feeblest of terms. My eyes were starting to burn, and a hot, solitary tear escaped my eye and began to roll down my cheek. The gardener continued working tirelessly, cutting back and destroying everything that was broken, withered, or ugly, and destroying them. There were even a few parts of the bush that were so devastated they could not be saved, so the gardener cut them off and threw them to the ground with the other weeds and thorns. I knew this wasn't done out of malice or lack of care. He was making room for something new to grow, which could never happen if the space was being occupied by something which was dead, dying, or killing off other healthy parts of the bush. Eventually, he reached the very heart of the bush. After cutting back all of the death and decay, something was being revealed. The last of the thorns had enveloped this precious thing at the center of the bush. I had to strain my neck to get a better look at what was hidden. To my surprise, completely hidden beneath this ugly mass was a nest, and in it, a single egg. I could not believe that hidden underneath this ugly mass, a precious egg had been laid. In fact, the egg had been purposely placed in the nest, knowing it would be completely protected until its time. Even though surrounded by thorns and thistles which were ugly and painful, they actually served to protect the precious life within. When the time was right, the egg would hatch and God would send little birds of faith and hope to feed, nurture, and protect. God always sends help when needed. The egg had been planted in me many years before and laid in the nest of my heart, which would protect it against any enemy. God had cleared away the debris of my life so that the new life within me could be born and flourish. When mature, the young bird would be strong enough to eventually leave the dark confines of the bush and fly free, being carried through the air by the very breath of God into its future. This was what happened to my spirit. It had to be crushed and strangled almost out of existence. But God, the gardener, has a plan for me. Even before I knew, he had placed his life inside of me, and when the time was right, he worked on me day and night to restore what had almost been strangled out of existence. He sent me help, hope, and faith to guide and nurture me. Eventually, his very breath caused my spirit to soar. My friend, this tangled mess is our lives, and God is our careful and loving gardener. Step by step, branch by branch, thorn by thorn, he will destroy our old and broken lives. What will emerge will be astounding, amazing, beautiful, strong, and capable. God will take us into our future by giving us new wings. We will be carried on the wind of his love, safety to our destiny. That day I started to know and understand the truest, deep, giving and protecting love of God. I pray you continue to bless those around you in your special way.
Thank you, Abby. Reading from the new book by Donna Ward, Forged by Fire, Crucible of Flame. And we've heard a reading from the book Forged by Fire from our co-presenter Abby of Crossing Point. And Donna, in your book, you talk a lot about self-respect.
I do.
Donna, what did self-respect mean to you, if anything at all? What does it mean to you now?
In terms of a before and after, I think definitely growing up and probably into my early mid-30s, I had no idea what self-respect was. I thought I did, but I actually didn't. Now, when I think about self-respect, I think about what I need, not in a kind of selfish, materialistic way, but what do I, Donna, need to have a fulfilled life? What do I need to have healthy relationships? What do I need to look after my physical health? And those things only came about because of my relationship with God, because if I hadn't have had his perspective on me, there's no way that I would have had my childhood thoughts and indoctrinations challenged. For the longest time, I'm known for being a workaholic. That is not unusual. My mother was a workaholic. I thought it was normal. And then when that started to impact my health, I found myself unable to rest, unable to sit back, unable to relax. And that was all tied up with this self-respect. Now, if I respect myself, I respect the fact that my body needs rest. I respect the fact that my mind needs rest. I respect the fact that I need to eat regularly and I need to sleep properly. And I didn't really have any of those inclinations for the longest time, John. And I would say it's only been the past 10 years that I have actively started to respect myself in a way that you can see and acknowledge. And that is because I've changed my view of myself. Not because I've changed myself, but because I've chosen to look at myself through God's eyes. And that is what made the difference, is understanding how much he loved me, understanding how much he wanted the best for me. It never occurred to me that I should have the best. I could have the best. That was never a thing. And so the more that I have absorbed and adopted God's perspective about me, the easier it's made those decisions of maybe saying no to a night out with friends, because actually I'm really tired and I need to rest, and I'll feel much better next week. And rather than running myself ragged, thinking that I'm some sort of crazy superwoman. So changing how I see myself and acknowledging myself as important as other people.
Abby, I know time is running out, but I don't know if you want to come in on what Donna has just said with some comments about self-respect.
Yeah, I have another fantastic quote from the book, in which, Donna, you've written, "In human society, to lower your head is to show respect to another person. Someone who walks with their head raised or held high is a sign that they have respect for themselves. Having that relationship with God, with the light, is I was forced to look up. He caused me to raise my head." A relationship with God causes us to respect ourselves. And I finally realized respect was not found in what I thought about myself. There was nothing to gain in this life relying on what others thought of me, but in what God believed about me. I love that. I know that as you shared at the beginning, there's a lot of the very low lows and a lot of the very high highs in relation to these encounters with God and the revelations that he was bringing you along the way, in and through the low lows and the tangled thorns and weeds that you share of in that garden extract. I guess the question I have for you is, was your experience of God and this relationship in which you share in the book, and you shared about the liberty and the freedom that truth has really brought to you as you've developed your relationship with him, did that come from you really intentionally actively seeking God, or did it come from him actively seeking you in your lows, in your experience, in your story?
I don't, it's a bit like the chicken and the egg, and I don't know which came first and which influenced the other. I would say I've always had a strong and motivated desire to actively connect with God, whether it's through worship or reading or acknowledging nature, like I did with the bush. That's something that I still do, and something that I find fulfilling. It's so special to me, and I've not been able to find that level of intimacy and connection in any other part of my life. So I don't know if God put that desire in me. I don't know if it's God chasing me down. I just don't know. It's syncopated. Like I know God doesn't need me, but sometimes it feels like we need each other. Like I say, God can do, I'm sure God can do without me, but I know he wants that relationship with me. And knowing that, just, it gives my soul an excitement. So of course I want to be with him back. Can
I ask you to elaborate on what you've just said of, I know that he wants me? Can you just share what you mean by that?
Okay, I distinctly remember the day that I realized God loved me. And it sounds ridiculous, growing up in a Christian home, going to church my entire life, and I was in my late 20s when I realized that God loved me. And it broke me to the point where I couldn't stop crying, because for the first time that I could actually remember, I knew that God wanted me. He didn't want me if I did X or if I did Y. He didn't want me only on my good days, but don't bother on bad days. He didn't want me so long as everybody around me liked me. None of those things were a factor. It didn't matter if I had committed the most heinous crime on this earth. I knew that he loved me. And I don't have a practical way of explaining that. All I know is it felt like my heart exploded and he came in it. And from that point on, I've never doubted it. I've never doubted it. It was a long time to get to that point, but once that revelation had happened, I couldn't undo it ever.
Mm-hmm. Wow. You put here in your book, even though I may lose my way and wander, he will always find me. I may stumble, fall, and be injured, but I will always be healed. I may come against things that will overpower me and block my path, but he will always rescue me. All I need to do is call on him.
And that's the truth. That has been the truth. So, and I hope I've expressed it well in my book, in that for every dark and dangerous and humiliating and horrific thing that I describe, it's never without hope, because somewhere in that, God is. He comes to you when you're in the dark. I was actually chuckling a couple of months ago, and I was talking to my daughter. I think I'd sent her to the shop or something like that. And she's like, oh, I don't like going in the dark by myself, because we've got wintertime dark evenings. And I just had to say to her, I says, I'm not scared of the dark. I've never been scared of the dark. And she kind of looked at me like, surely you have. I'm like, no. I said, I enjoy the dark. And it's not that I like dark and scary things, But what my life has done repeatedly is showed me that when I'm in those dark places, God comes to you in those dark places. There is no space that we can occupy where God won't come and find us.
Wow.
Amen to that. Amen to that. I'm afraid our time is almost up. Our special guest today has been the writer Donna Ward. And Donna, the book is Forged by Fire. Where can people get a copy?
It will be available to buy on Amazon in about 2 weeks, and you can also go to my website around the same time, donnaward-books.co.uk.
That address again, please.
So it's donnaward-books.co.uk.
If I can do a quick plug for you to the listeners, this is a really fantastic autobiography that Donna has written. It's got some fantastic analogies in it that just bring the reality of experience in abuse and in the revelation of God's love and God's heart, and the journey of that untangling and of that releasing, just so tangible in the time of reading, and your humor, Donna, goes with it really well to bring some quite difficult topics that you share of and experiences that you share of into a lighter place, having shared the difficulty to enable both people who have experienced abuse to a point of revelation of truth, but also those who might not have experienced it to a place of understanding, and the story of liberty and freedom and hope and joy in this is fantastic, and I would encourage anybody, whether they've experienced abuse or not, to read this when it comes out. And thank you so much for giving us a sneak peek ahead of its release in a few weeks' time.
You're welcome.
Donna, thank you very much indeed. A big thank you to Abby at Crossing Point as well. This has been Walking on Eggshells on Flame Radio, made in conjunction with Crossing Point in Liverpool, a Christian response to domestic abuse. And we're going to go out finally with one final piece of music today. Thanks for your company today. We'll be back again next month.